line with the talk you got. So Gordon is a professor of environmental medicine at the New York University School of Medicine. He holds a BS in physiology, an MS in toxicology from Michigan, and a PhD in toxicology from MIT, and was appointed to the faculty of the Department of Environmental Medicine in 1989. He has served as an ad hoc member of grant review panels and site review teams for the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Coalition for Cancer Research, DOD, Bureau of Mines, NASA, Health Canada, CDC, and EPA only. Dr. Gordon is past chair of the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists Threshold Limit Values Committee. Yeah, where we were colleagues. He was the president and I was a worker. So his broad research interest is inhalation toxicology. The major focus is on pathogenesis of the adverse pulmonary effects produced by environmental and occupational agents. He's a active member of the Society of Toxicology and has served on the program, placement, membership, and awards committees, and as president of the Inhalation Specialty subsection. He has served as a consultant to EPA and on EPA's Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, and his current research interests are supported by he won't let me this guy's got a great resume.
I hate this stuff.
All right. He's going to speak today on to vape or not to vape. Dr. Gordon.
Now you stole my intro. Yeah. I've worked with Bob for a couple of decades. To vape or not to vape, okay, a little bit of Shakespeare in there. My lab has done a lot of stuff, but the last 10 or 15 years as I get toward retirement, I've only done stuff that is interesting, impactful, and fun, and these are the many things that my lab has done, mostly exposure assessment, from fireworks, subway pollution, 3D printing, and food carts, alternative tobacco products, both e-cigs and hookah, low-cost sensors to use around the world in the communities, and now microplastics and a little bit of nanoplastics, so I am not too focused. So today it's going to be e-cigs. I'll do a general intro, talk about are e-cigs safe or safer, is there cancer, respiratory tract, flavors is like the big bugaboo, and I'll get into that just a little bit, and then secondhand exposure, and then what's the FDA have to say about all this? So when you think about quitting smoking, what do you want to do? You go cold turkey, nicotine patch or gum, hypnosis. Some people switch to e-cigs, and bottom line is e-cigs for cessation is probably the best route to go because it gets the oral part and the habits, but you always need help. And then the latest, which hasn't been approved in the United States yet, but is huge in Korea and Japan, is heat not burn cigarettes, where they don't burn it. They just put a stick of tobacco in there and a heating coil heats it, and you get all the flavors and everything you want. And the nicotine, which you're addicted to, right? So there's a lot of new faces of tobacco and these alternative tobacco products, the hookah, cigarillos, and then there's the BDs, which are mostly from Southeast Asia, and then of course e-cigs and chewing tobacco, snus, lots of new things out there. So what do you guys think the most popular tobacco product is? I have 3 or 4 questions embedded here, so what do you guys think the most popular tobacco product is? Okay, anything else?
Marijuana.
That doesn't count, but you're right. So it's pretty much e-cigs right now among high school students. This is pre-pandemic, which is some of the best data, because since the pandemic happened, it was really hard for kids to get the product. So e-cigs by far almost triple what cigarettes are. But smokeless tobacco is up there. So for those who don't know, quickly, this is what an e-cig is. You have, you inhale, so you inhale on the right side, and it's got a little pressure sensor and a microprocessor computer in there, and these disposable $5 things. It's amazing. So you inhale, pressure sensor goes off, it tells the battery to heat the coil, which is surrounded by this e-liquid, which has the nicotine in it, and that's what you inhale. It vaporizes it. By the time it's your mouth, it's an aerosol. So that's what e-cig does. It's a delivery system for nicotine. But there's been a rapid evolution. You see in the far left, they call them cigalites. They look just like cigarettes. And those were truly the ones we first started doing research on. And then they just made them fancy and pretty to sell them. So then in the middle, you see those guys, and you can refill it. So you can go buy e-liquid, and then you can bring e-liquid back, and when you're done, fill it up again. So you can keep reusing the systems. And then on the far right, you're getting into the mods, and that's like generation 3. And the mod systems have a big battery, and you can take a whole 500 ml breath of this thing. So if you're out in the street and you see someone vaping, and you see a big cloud, they probably have a mod in their hand. If it's a small cloud, they probably have one of the ones to the left, because that's just like a cigarette, and you just take a 50 ml puff. But for the mods, it is pretty amazing. So are there adverse health effects of e-cigs? Of course I'm going to say yes. So people have reported respiratory tract inflammation and some injury. One study at NYU, this guy found lung cancer in mice. There have been immune effects where it could be tough to fight off infections. If you've heard about methylation of DNA, it turns on and off some of the sites, the promoter sites for different genes. They found methylation changes in the lung and the bladder. And then there is death. So I'll get into the EVALI cases just really quickly, because there have been deaths, and those were e-cigs being used. So cancer. Well, what's in e-cigs that might cause cancer? There's all these really weird flavorings, the cinnamaldehyde, benzaldehyde, vanillin, banana flavors, diacetyl, which is butter flavor, like you get in microwave popcorn. Well, you used to get in microwave popcorn. But the main component is the propylene glycol and the vegetable glycerin. Those are usually 50-50, and then you have a little bit of nicotine in there. But are there carcinogen in e-cigarettes? So there are, but it depends on how you operate your e-cig. If you're using a very simple device and the wattage, the power from the battery is very low, you're not going to get too much of these carbonyls, acetaldehyde and formaldehyde, which do contribute to cancer. So only when you crank up that mod, those people are getting a much bigger dose. And I think those levels are similar to what comes out of a cigarette. So is there cancer? Yeah, one study found that if you expose them for a year, you get cancer. But you got to ask, how is this possible to this cancer? Because these cigarettes themselves really do have about 80 or 90% fewer carcinogens than cigarettes. And the UK's public health division department, whatever it is, they decided that e-cigs are safer and have 95% safer, just because they have fewer carcinogens and toxic chemicals. So we found it in mice, right, but human studies. So as we were talking about yesterday with asbestos and mesothelioma, cancer takes a long time to develop. So considering that e-cigs were introduced to the States about 2007, and they really didn't take off like crazy until Juul hit the market in 2016, 17, all these kids and people who are using them they're the guinea pigs of the future for e-cigs. So it'll be determined. But there, as I said, there's non-cancer health effects. They've documented, because it's shorter term, there's documented increases in asthma, there's chronic obstructive pulmonary disease changes, and there's even cardiovascular risks. So there's increases in chest pain, some myocardial infarctions, heart attacks, and arrhythmias. But these associations to these chronic cardiopulmonary diseases, they're really, really, really hard to discern, because is it the vaping? Because if a person's vaping for a couple years, they were probably smoking cigarettes for decades. So to attribute something like COPD or cardiovascular risk to the current e-cig use, you know, as one of the premier epidemiologists of the past, he knows that it's really hard. An association does not mean there's a cause. So it's going to take a while. And then, and this is the most fun stuff for us, is that a huge fraction of current e-cig users, they don't just use e-cigs, they use cigarettes and e-cigs. And they vape THC. So it's really a complicated system. So working with Michael Weitzman, who, you know, the big lawsuit that won billions for the states from the tobacco industry, he was one of the 2 or 3 key medical doctors, and he ended up at NYU and was a colleague and friend for the last decade. So we got together and we started doing studies, and we did some studies in humans. And we got non-smokers, e-cig users, cigarette-only users, and then people who use both products. And we didn't want to make this too invasive. We just collected some biosamples that were easy to get, saliva, urine, blood sticks like a diabetic does, and then some nasal lining fluid. And we looked at physiology too, pulmonary cardiovascular function effects. And we didn't see much in the lung and the heart. We weren't surprised, but as researchers, of course, we were disappointed, but that's the problem being a toxicologist. You don't really want to see adverse effects, but you do if you want to keep doing research. But we did see increases in cotinine in the saliva from the users. And oddly, we saw increases in these inflammatory proteins, cytokines, in the nose, but not in saliva. So what the heck was that about? How could we see something in the nose when obviously you're inhaling through your mouth? Everything should have been in the mouth. And then we wanted to see if the nasal findings were repeatable. And bottom line is, when we did the repeat study, it was after COVID. And we realized, well, this was stupid. I mean, my PhD student had to get her degree, but we should have postponed until COVID was over because there's systemic inflammation from COVID. So, problem. But here's what we did. We recruited tobacco users. This has 35 non-vaping, non-smoking people, and then e-cig users. This is a real sciencey graph, but just quickly you see there's 9 different cytokines up there, and the white bars are the controls, non-smoking, non-vaping, and the e-cig users are in blue. And you can see for a lot of these, if not all of these, the nasal cytokines were significantly increased. So that meant something was going on. But as I said, there was nothing in the saliva, in the mouth, so why was there a nasal effect? Well, this is where it's really good to have clever and young postdocs and students in your lab. Because I was like, this shouldn't happen. This is not real. We shouldn't see something in the nose if we didn't see it in the saliva. And postdoc went on the internet and within seconds with Google found that nasal effects may have something to do with vaping because of this craziness. So people exhale through their nose. And so I don't know that middle guy, how he's doing it out of one nostril. So we wanted to determine if vaping exposes the nose to these products' emissions differently than smoking. So we had tobacco cohort, vapors and smokers. This is, and we found that, and we actually, so they went on the streets of Manhattan, and I helped a little bit. So they went on the streets of Manhattan, postdoc and a student, and they watched people. Of course, they pretend they were playing on their phone so that people wouldn't think they were stalking them. So they went on the streets of Manhattan, and was it a male or female? What was the ethnicity that they could observe? And did they exhale through the nose, only, the mouth only, or both? Cigarettes and e-cigarettes. So they looked at vapors, they looked at exclusive smokers, and mouth and nose exhalation. The vaping and the smoking are mixed up there. So is it a fad or is it real? Well, she showed me that it was real. So this is a simple Venn diagram. So the yellowish is people who mouth only. So in the cigarettes, 78% of the people exhaled through their mouth, and only 4.9% exhaled only through their nose. Whereas the e-cigs, a third of the people exhaled through their mouth, and 63% exhaled through their nose and their mouth. So it was about a 3- or 4-fold increase of people who were exhaling through their nose on the streets of Manhattan. So that's probably why we saw all these changes in the nose. But we also wanted to look at some things like outside the lungs and the heart. So if you're familiar with smoking, smoking often comes with people who have mental health issues. So it's associated with cigarette smoking, but what about e-cigs? And as I said, it's really hard to pinpoint associations because they could have smoked previously, they could be dual using. So how are we going to say, if we observe a mental health issue like depression, how will we know that's really from e-cigs? It was tough. And then you have the question, what comes first? Is someone depressed and they smoke or vape, or is someone smoke or vape and it changes the brain and then they start being depressed? So this is what's called a forest plot, and I'm sure maybe only one or two of you know what this is, but just briefly, if you look at the red slotted line, that's 1, and that means the odds of having something are 1.0, maybe and maybe not. So that means nothing's happening. So if you look at this, if you're dual users, and this is looking at whether the person had moderate to severe internalizing problems, which means depression. I couldn't get my student to just say depression. So a dual user, using this huge database, they found that almost 3.5-fold increase in depression in the dual users. If you use an e-cig with no smoking history or smoking history, it's 2.5 or 3-fold. Non-combustible tobacco users with no smoking history, everybody was above 1. And if those error bars don't cross 1, that means it's statistically significant. But what was interesting, thinking about secondhand smoke, was that if you look at the bottom 2, there's like a 1.5, 1.6-fold increase if you were exposed to secondhand smoke as well as secondhand e-cigs. And that was not expected. So just to summarize these health effects, minor respiratory effects, there's been some mental health associations, and I'm not presenting, but we studied cell toxicity, and we found that cells in vitro were affected by the products. So smoking cessation, you're not allowed to answer. What single factor do tobacco researchers believe had the biggest impact on reducing the use of cigarettes in the United States? Money's part of it, but they still smoked anyway. But what? Pardon? I can't. No, but I wish that was true. They all had an effect, but from what the tobacco people like Michael Weitzman told me, the fact that we were talking about secondhand smoke. So when they decided that secondhand smoke indoors had to be banned or within 50 feet of your workplace, that just drove down the smoking because people smoked less, they spent less. So they attribute a lot of it to not only the cessation devices like e-cigs and the cost, but secondhand smoke really mattered. So secondhand smoke, restaurant, bars, airplanes, home and work, linked to infections and asthma in kids. There's even lung cancer in non-smokers exposed to secondhand smoke. So, but nobody had talked about e-cig exposure. So there is secondhand exposure to e-cig emissions. What do you think is the difference between secondhand smoke from cigarettes and e-cig and how it's generated? It's sort of weird, but when you're smoking a cigarette, the smoker exhales and the cigarette lays there and burns. So it's two sources. But for an e-cig, the e-cig doesn't burn while you lay it down. So the only thing that secondhand e-cig smoke, so to speak, is what the person exhales. So it's totally different product because the person inhaled it and probably changed the temperature and humidity, absorbed some of the particles, so it's a different game. So we went into homes just to measure secondhand e-cig emissions. And we measured air quality. We did the first Yeah, we did it in New York City before, during, and after we had them vape. So we had them smoke or vape, and we measured pollution before, during, and after in non-smoking households, cigarette homes, e-cig, and then we did hookahs, but I'm not going to present that. And obviously, we found that the particle concentration in the cigarettes homes went up the highest, well, second highest. Hookah homes went up the highest, actually. But it also went up in e-cig only homes, and it really depended on, as I said earlier, it really depended on their e-cig device. So when the person was using a mod, it was a much higher concentration. And that's like over 1,000 microgram per cubic meter. And you go outside, this is going to be 5 or 10 micrograms. So it's a huge increase indoors in the homes. So has anybody observed secondhand exposure effects from e-cigs? And we went in, we measured pulmonary function, heart rate, cardiovascular function, and inflammation. And we looked at the non-smoking adults and non-smoking kids. And we did find that the nasal cytokines in the kids were elevated, totally unexpected. Kids must have been sensitive, but of the 10 different cytokines we looked at, so this is the green is the non-smoking, non-vaping homes, and the blue is the e-cig homes. And you can see that for several of these, there were statistically significant elevations. And in some of the cases, it was more, like for this IL-6 in the middle, it was much more than in the cigarette smoke homes. So that was surprising. So we saw it was elevated in the kids. It was also elevated in the secondhand adults, but not as much as in the kids. So we got this nasal inflammation, no pulmonary function changes in the adults or kids exposed secondhand. Outside the home, vaping in schools. So high school kid came to me for a science project, and he was concerned, and this was his humor, high school humor, why are people peeing in the jewel room? And they truly thought it was a jewel room. So this was done back 2017, 18, so it really was pre-pandemic. So, didn't do right. So where do you guys think the most vaping occurred? In the high school bathrooms or the middle school bathrooms? And it's New York State, so middle school is 6th, 7th, and 8th. No, it was the high school. High school kids caught on. And even though it's a low number, it was about double. Now the data that we found was a little bit biased because the kids said, we wanted to measure away from where the teachers and the administrative offices were, because that's where the kids were vaping. They didn't want to be caught. Of course, there was no smoking, but it was about double or triple in the high school bathrooms. So where do you think the most vaping occurred, boys or girls' bathrooms? It was actually the boys, but not by much. It was pretty similar, which surprised us. So vaping's going on. So where do we stand today? There's evidence of vaping, respiratory toxicity. I said there was immune responses, there's increased asthma and some respiratory disease. Mice showed us there were some lung tumors. As I said, the Public Health England insists that e-cigs are 95% safer. This is a little study that they did where they put cigarettes through this jar with cotton balls and e-cigs, and you can tell the cigarettes are on the left and the e-cigs are on the right. CBS Morning Show came to our lab and we repeated it, and of course we got the same result. And then of course they cut me off when I said e-cigs are safe, but are they safer than cigarettes? And they just cut that out, and that was the key thing. They made it seem like they just wanted, the media just wanted to tell e-cigs are safe, but they're probably not safe. They're just safer than cigarettes. So I'm going to finish with a few slides on the FDA, and they have this deeming rule. So in 2016, they extended their authority to all tobacco products. Be interesting to see what the courts will say about that now, since they extended it themselves. So e-cigs and hookahs are now under their designation. At that time, they made it an 18-year-old minimum. I think it's back up to 21 in all states. Warning labels, of course, on these new tobacco products, no free samples. But they gave a break those products on the market. So they had like 3 years to apply and get approved. So to me, the real world circumstances for e-cig users, FDA is really slow in all their rulemaking, and they have little to no enforcement. I mean, you guys might not go on the web and go to the e-cig sites as much as I do, but whatever you want, you can buy online. And the FDA did one thing, is that they took away the right for Juuls to be on the market, which they just allowed them to come back on the market with their tobacco and menthol flavored, I think, a week or two, maybe 2 weeks ago. So the markets, whatever you want, they're flooded with devices. You can buy nicotine, you can vape nicotine, THC. One of my students came to me and said, I want to do a thesis project on CBD, cannabidiols. I'm like, who would do that? That's what the cream you put on when you have soreness, or people take oral drops to calm them down. But she said, no, people are vaping it. So people are vaping anything. And now they're vaping caffeine. And as I'll show you, they're just vaping flavors. And it's changing really fast. 3 weeks ago, they authorized for the first time that Enjoy, the company, can sell 4 different menthol flavored products. And that's the first non-tobacco flavor to be allowed on the market. And then there's flavors changing fast. So, and I'll get to flavors in a second, but this came out like a few days ago that R.J. Reynolds, they completed this PMTA, it's the big submission to get approval, that they're going to have a e-cig, which is they call Vuse Pro, and it's going to be age gated. So they want to ensure that the kid is not under 21 years old. So 80,000 pages of scientific data, and they're going to regulate it so that e-cig is locked if they don't verify that they're over 21 or greater. But flavors really change fast. This was just from our study. You can see over half of the flavoring is fruit flavored. But menthol in different various and mint also. And a small flavor to THC. That was just in our group that admitted using THC. And then 2 weeks ago, Reynolds, which was R.J. Reynolds and American Tobacco combined, they're selling e-cigs now only with flavors, no nicotine. And the question is, does FDA, are they involved at all? They can just sell these things. And if you notice, what they're selling looks just like these ELF bars. These guys are huge. So a regular e-cig on the left, you might get it enough, it might be like 1 or 2 packs of e-cig equivalent, but the big ELF bars on the right there, they're equivalent to 500 puffs. So it ends up to be many, many packs of cigarettes. And the problem is, and although this slide says FEMA, I thought FDA has to rule it when it comes to flavors in e-cigs and cigarettes. But all these flavors that we put in our food, they're generally recognized as safe, oral consumption. They weren't really evaluated for inhalation toxicity, but the propylene glycol and the vegetable oil are the main carriers in e-cigs, and they weren't developed or proved for safety by inhalation. And this is just, one colleague, Lona Jaspers from University of North Carolina, and she did this little study, and she put these cinnamon flavors in this plastic petri dish, 6-well plate, and you can't quite see it, but the middle ones, there's some corroded plastic just from the middle cinnamon. I can't even read it. But in the upper right, the cinnamaldehyde actually dissolved the plastic. So this is what she uses in community talks, just to say, the flavors can be bad. So how successful are the FDA regulations and enforcement? I don't think so. There's that couple minutes left, sir? Okay. So I mentioned the Valley, e-cig or vaping-associated lung injury. Huge episode. There was over 1,000 ER visits, many deaths. All the patients used e-cigarettes when they were questioned. And some clever docs in the Midwest picked up some clues. It happened at a certain time, mostly in beginning of 2019, late 2018, It ended up, when they asked them, they said they were vaping THC products. It was almost always young men, and most of the THC e-liquids had vitamin E acetate for whatever reason that made it vaping better. And this is just a New England Journal article, and they show in these patients, if you see that, the median age of these guys was 23, 70% were males, 16% swore they only use nicotine products, and the rest said they used THC, and they had very severe lung disease, or some people died. When I asked a leading tobacco policy researcher, I said, how many people, if the doctor asked them if they use THC, would say no? And he said about 20%. So it could be that all these people were using THC, which they bought online. Mom and pop stores online made up these things. And was there a solution? No. The cases declined rapidly in 2019 and early 2020, probably because people heard about this. But the FDA didn't really step in. And the CDC and the FDA did a lot of research trying to identify what's causing these illnesses and deaths. But they didn't get too far because COVID pandemic hit. And so they actually stopped collecting the cases and just went on to COVID in early 2020. So Alona Jaspers also did this. You know, what words come to mind when you hear about e-cigs or vaping? I'll sort of skip and not ask you guys, but this is what she asked about 100 people, and she made this word salad. This is what AI does for you now. You just put in all the words, and bigger the word, the more it was mentioned. So this is what came up, and it was all bad things. There's almost nothing in here about safety or cessation from cigarettes. So e-cigs, controversial as all get out, but has unparalleled promise simultaneously for both harm and for benefit for people to stop smoking. But the e-cig use has skyrocketed in adolescents and young adults, as high as 20% in high school, 5% in middle school, but it has tremendous promise for harm reduction among adult smokers. So people do fancy models that only Bob would understand probably. And when they do it, they find that, yeah, kids are getting addicted to nicotine and there's a risk, and yes, there's some toxicity for e-cigs, but overall, if it helps this many people quit smoking, there's a lot of health benefits. And then they translate that to the life years saved. So I really think FDA has to step up to the plate. The public messaging has been really conflicting, often opposite directions. So I would like to thank all my collaborators, and that's Michael Weissman, smoking hookah with his son. Any questions?
So our policy on questions is please step to the microphone so that we can record them, and we'll ask people in Zoom land, send your questions in through the chat mechanism, and Larry will try to get those questions and then come to the mic. So please ask your questions.
The question is that over the years, of course, you know, I guess it was back in the 60s where they started putting the cancer stuff on the packages and everything else. Do you think it may be time that the medical or insurance industry says that you may not have coverage for treatment of lung or bladder cancer if you were a smoker, because all those treatments pass on to everybody else that is not a smoker? Or that would, just a curiosity.
This is why I love these kind of discussions. I have never heard anybody say that. That would be great. I mean, they do have pre-existing conditions. Well,
we
you
do it for
smoke.
everything else.
I'm sorry, we're not going to cover you for lung and bladder cancer.
Yeah,
That'd be great.
Thank you for your comments on secondhand smoking. Yeah. There's been publicity in the last half year about putting limits on menthol flavors, and like on only menthol flavors. Are they more dangerous than peach or cinnamon or something? Because if not, it's like we're discriminating against those Americans who favor menthol, who tend to be minority communities. How do we unravel these complicated second and third-hand effects of the research that gets done?
That's about the hardest question I've ever had. The FDA does not want people addicted to nicotine, but they can't stop it. So that's why they went with tobacco only in e-cigs, and for cigarettes, I think it's tobacco, of course, flavored, and menthol. And I've read that the Afro-American community has been up in arms because they don't want the menthol banned, or they do want the menthol banned. But there's something biochemically that's involved in African Americans, supposedly, that they prefer the menthol. But that could just be decades and decades of tradition and advertising, and big bias in advertising. So I like the previous idea. You got to ban cigarettes.
Let me ask one more easy question here. My father-in-law was a family practitioner, and in the 50s, he prescribed amphetamines to women who wanted to stop smoking. And it worked quite well, and then had to prescribe things to help them sleep at night, so they ended up kind of drug-based lives, but not heroin addicts. But it helped with two things: not smoking and obesity, because they were running around. And I've studied, and it appears that smoking cigarettes makes you put something in your mouth, and you're not eating when a lot of people aren't eating as much when they're smoking. So is there some complex correlation, but not necessarily causation, between smoking less and getting fatter?
I've always assumed that was true.
Yeah. Well,
because
then how
many smokers are thin.
Yeah. If we think being thin is a good health outcome, which I don't, what do we do about that? That would probably do nothing.
Well, possibly obesity is a bigger problem in the United States now than smoking. Yeah. And both should be controlled. But I don't think smoking should be the answer for weight loss.
Hi.
Hi.
So the people I know who vape, of course, are addicted, but they do these crazy flavors.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that they've now come out with flavors without nicotine.
Yes.
So is that supposed to help someone quit? That seems like that would not be effective if you're going from nicotine. What's the point of that? Just to get more people to do it?
The Chinese scientist who invented e-cigs back in the late 90s, he did that because his father died of lung cancer. And the idea was to have e-cigs, and then you could decrease your nicotine to nothing. And then you weaned yourself off. And then, yeah. So I think there's a dual purpose. I mean, the whole purpose was to have e-cigarettes and sell as zero nicotine. But now this flavor thing is just, it's going to make it cool, and they might buy sometimes with nicotine to try it.
But there's no in-between step. I mean, you're having to wean yourself on how often you smoke.
No, you can buy e-cigs with various levels of nicotine.
Oh, you can?
Oh, yeah.
Clearly,
but not all
know.
brands. Or you can buy the e-liquid to use in your mod. But, Juul used to sell, and it was always, I think, 50 milligram per ml of nicotine. And that was all. But in the past, we've bought e-cigs and liquids that were different concentrations.
And so those flavors come that way now, too. I got it. Okay. Because I wanted to obviously recommend this flavor, nicotine-free free flavor.
Yes. I mean,
To people I know.
there's no telling if the flavors themselves are safe toxicology-wise,
Right.
or whatever the PGVG we call it, propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin. We don't know if those are perfectly safe. As I said, if you crank up the voltage and wattage, you're going to get more carcinogens made.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we don't have any questions from the chat, so this is my own. You showed some data about how many people or percentage of people that exhale through their mouth, through their nose, or both. But did you go the next step and say how much ill effect was associated with those groups? After all, you saw an ill effect from secondhand smoke, and we know that the majority of taste is actually the volatile compounds that waft up into the nose. And maybe the olfactory bulb has the biggest effect.
Yes, but you just described a very expensive, long study.
Yeah.
So we were using a database where they had exclusive e-cig users and dual users and cigarettes, and we didn't believe it because their definition of exclusive e-cig users, did you not use cigarettes and have you vaped in the last 30 days? So my student's project was just getting what she defined as, and they lied. And THC was supposed to be excluded, and it ended up the dual users, as many as 70% of them used THC, vaping or smoking weed. So your study would be the logical next step, but it'd be very hard to get it funded.
On the other hand, you have some data from the secondhand smoke.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm curious about the cost. How does the cost of vaping compare to cigarettes? And I have another question related to this, the e-cigs with,
Your memory's probably better than mine. First question.
okay,
They try, from what I've gathered, they try and control the cost of the e-cigs so it's about the same as cigarettes. So it's all about nicotine content. So when I talked to some guy in England in a vape shop, he said it takes 300 puffs a day from his e-cig. And I said, how are you alive? And he looked at me like I was an idiot. He goes, of course we decreased the nicotine concentration. So it's all about getting the nicotine that your brain says I need. And I think they manipulate the e-cig prices. So it's, at one point it was getting more expensive than cigarettes. So I think they had to back off. But it's all about money.
right.
I mean, Juul was punished because they advertised to youth, which was illegal.
My other question is, and this may be, I have no idea what I'm talking about here really, but the THC e-cigs, has anybody ever looked at that for pain relief, like weed?
Both, we're trying to form a center looking at that as the benefit part, and then we're going to all study the cost part. Cannabidiol and THC have both been used.
Right.
And that's probably one of the biggest medical uses, is people who have cancer and pain of any kind. So it's a legitimate use, and it's prescribed for that.
Okay.
I don't know if people go to their local vape shop or their cannabis shop and do it that way, or they just buy it offline. Hopefully they do it through the legal means, because it's much better quality control.
Well, in Kentucky, it's legal now, so medical
Yeah.
use.
Yeah.
What about the taxes? I mean, raising taxes in various states is a really big deal. And I know that some states, for example, I live on the border of Indiana and Michigan, and they tax it differently. They tax cigarettes differently, and I don't know what they do with the vaping products.
I'm not up to date on that, but you're right. Taxes differ on gasoline, and that's why the New Yorkers drive to New Jersey. I can't answer that, but it would be a good way to, as mentioned before, raise the price.
Yeah, and I don't even know if they tax the vape, I mean, do they tax, there's luxury taxes, obviously, so gasoline
I don't have,
and alcohol are taxed differently than the regular sales tax. And I just wondered if vape products are with the
well, I'm
regular sales tax.
assuming they can only tax something that's legally on the market. And until the FDA approved the Views tobacco flavored only a couple years ago, and now the 4 menthol, Juul was off the market. So I don't know if you can tax something that's not legal.
Okay.
So all the stuff on the web, I'm sure it's not taxed, except maybe sales tax. Okay.
Okay, so
Thank you.
Let's thank Terry for presentation. And let me just mention, next week we're going to have a speech on preserving farmland in a crowded world. So come back and see us the same time, same station. Terry will stick around here if you have any questions for a few minutes. And we thank you for coming. Bob, I yield to my boss.
And just a reminder that we're not taxing for these presentations, but it's costing us money to do it. And in June, we gave our 6th consecutive scholarship to a science student at Chautauqua Lake Central School, and it's your donations that help us to do that. And while we struggle, we have a Zoom and website that we have to pay to run, and we pay the church to be here, and we pay someone to help us run the technology, and we have comfortable seats. And so if you'd like to help us, there is a basket at the back. And tell your friends to come next week. We love seeing you here. Thank you.